Hey, this is Derek Cafe with Cafe Realty. Before I get started, I want to remind anybody, if you find value in the content that I provide, please like, comment, and share, and subscribe, of course. Subscribe to the channel. I am a licensed general contractor here in the Atlanta Metro, along with a commercial real estate broker. And I talk about things related to real estate investing, wealth building, urban planning, economics, and how all of that intertwines to get you the best life possible. So today I wanted to talk more about the construction side of things, and specifically, should you pull a permit on projects? When I first started, as I got into the construction and I became a real estate agent and later broker, it was an offshoot of me being a real estate investor. So I first started buying my first property, which was a house hack. And then later on, I got my real estate agents and real estate brokers license. Then I got my license as a general contractor. So all of this was meant to enhance me as a real estate investor. So did I pull permits on my first projects? No, absolutely not. I winged it. I basically was a student of YouTube University, and that's how I got started in the construction end of things. I just went on YouTube, found how to install a kitchen cabinet, how to install a window, how to frame a door, how to do this. And I was just very much hands-on learning how to put together and eventually build a house. So I did not pull permits on my first a good number of projects. The only time I actually started pulling permits on projects were when I absolutely needed to, because then you get into these projects that are both interior and exterior full gut renovations, meaning like in some cases you're replacing all the siding, replacing all the windows, replacing this, that, and the other. And it's like very obviously that you are doing a renovation and needed to pull permits for these projects. And when I decided I was going to get my GC license, because then I needed a record of doing the work of a GC. So I did not pull permits initially, but at some point I found it to be very useful for my ambitions, and that's when I started to pull permits. So as a now licensed GC, you would think, okay, now I could pull permits anytime I want. Why wouldn't I pull permits on every single job? And the answer might surprise you a little bit. And the biggest thing comes down to the fact that a client can call you up and say, hey, I want my kitchen cabinets replaced. And you can look at it like, okay, I'm just going to replace the kitchen cabinets. But it may be in the scope of that, maybe you're touching some plumbing or you're touching some electrical, and technically you're supposed to pull a permit in many municipalities, not all municipalities, but in many times, anytime you're touching plumbing, electrical, HVAC, you're supposed to pull a building permit. So now it's not just you and your client, it's you, your client, and the building inspector now as that third party. So you and your client have a scope of work, but once the building inspector gets involved, the scope of work can expand. And that expansion can be not so nice for a client's budget. For example, I'm doing a project. The initial scope of the project was $20,000, or the initial quote for the project was $20,000. Now, we brought in the building inspector because I was a little hesitant, because it was a very simple job. It was a warehouse remodel, and all we were doing is removing 1,600 square feet of office space that was in addition to the original office space. They needed more warehouse space than they needed office space. And we were going to come in, just demo it, move on, and happy client, move on to the next. Because I wanted to just double check, make sure that, hey, because we're going to be on this very busy road, And I don't want any city staff to be come by, because we're going to have dumpsters out front and people going in and out of the warehouse, and you're obviously going to be able to see that something's going on in the property. So I just didn't want to have any sort of issues. I went up to the city and said, hey, I'm demoing this. That's all we're touching. We're not adding anything back. It's only removing stuff. Do we need a permit? They went back and forth. We don't know. But ultimately they said, hey, we're going to require a permit to be pulled for this. And basically, when we had the permit get pulled, the scope of work expanded drastically based off of, and I'm not going to say the scope of work went up that much. The scope of work didn't go up that much, but the items that were required did boost up the cost of the job, from a job that ultimately started off at roughly $20,000 to a job that went up to $100,000. Now, from the perspective of me as the GC, it may sound like, oh my goodness, that's great. I was going to just do this job for $20,000. Now I have a project that is $100,000. It's great if your client has the funds and your client is willing to spend the funds. That's a big jump from $20,000 to $100,000 project. And a part of the reason it went that way, because there's many people like, oh, how did it go up that high? First, it just came to the building inspector added on certain items that they wanted to see within the scope of work, everything from life safety items, such as a 1 hour fire rated wall between the warehouse space and the office space, and other items such as some electrical and things of that nature. And overall, once I got the quotes back from several subs, we wound up where it was going to be, versus an additional $15,000 to $20,000, it was going to be $50,000. So that brought up additional $50,000 on top of their original $20,000. And so since they decided, since they're going to have to spend that money, they were like, hell, let's just go for what we really want. So the project expanded in scope to a $100,000 project now. And if my client had not been in a position to, if my client was not a international logistics company, that may have just been like, absolutely not. We don't even have the money to do that. And some of the other things that they wanted to have done, that was the case. It was just cost prohibitive. They weren't able to go forward. And it's different for a business, because a business may have the money coming in to be able to support this. But for homeowners, when you have a project that for you was already expensive, and then because of different things, the inspector says, hey, because you're touching this, I also want you to touch that. For example, on one of my rental properties, I redid the deck. And with that deck, all we're touching is the deck of the rear deck of the property, nothing else. But the inspector wanted me to add new electrical, outlet boxes in the rear, and they wanted a new floodlight in the rear, shining down on the steps. Now, because that would be something that meets today's code. And this is a house that was built in 1932. There's many code revisions. And matter of fact, I don't think there probably was a building code. I don't know when the building code actually started, but yeah, there's been many revisions to the code probably since 1932. And so I had to add an electrical component. Now that's a small example, and it cost, I think it added an extra $700 to $1,100 onto the costs that I originally had. But that to some people, that additional $700 to $1,100 is major. And if it's major, that means that you can afford it. And for me as a GC, that could mean the difference between getting the job and not getting the job, simply because the client just doesn't have the funds to do it. Now, you as a GC could always seek to what's called value engineer. So, for example, if there's an architect involved, the architect could recommend to do it one way to meet the code, but there may be another way that's less expensive in order to meet the code. And value engineering is basically getting the same thing done, but maybe switching up different materials or different designs to reduce materials or to potentially have cheaper materials or to make it cut down on labor costs. Those are just different ways that can help to cut down on construction costs. So smaller projects can really go up based off of pulling a permit. Anytime you're touching plumbing, electrical, HVAC, or MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, you need to pull a permit. It's sometimes very vague. They say it in different ways, but a lot of times they want to say anytime you're really touching it, but sometimes they'll be like, okay, if it's only cosmetic. So if you have a bathroom and you're just switching out the vanity, maybe switching out the toilet, replacing some towel, you don't need to pull a permit. But sometimes when you're in the midst of it, they might not know that you didn't touch this. They might think that you come up, say you didn't pull a permit because you're like, oh, it's only cosmetic, so I don't need to pull a permit. The inspector, when they show up at the door, because they're just seeing that some construction activity is happening, they can't tell what you did do, what you didn't do. In some cases, sometimes it's very easy. Well, obviously, this towel is from the 70s. We can't even buy this towel anymore. For us to have this, if it's still outdated, yeah, we didn't touch this because it's still outdated. But this right here, that's shiny and new, that could have been done by somebody else. Like maybe it was done 5-7 years ago, but it looks new. So they're like, you put this in place and this, and there was never a permit pulled on that project. So then the inspector may say, hey, I want you to mess with this or open up this because obviously somebody updated it and we don't know if they did it right or not, and we want to check. And so for you to move forward with your portion that you were hired for, you need to basically bring this other portion that you had nothing to do with up to code, or we need to check and make sure that it's up to code. And it just adds a mixed bag on what you have to do, and both from the perspective of the investor and the GC, because once again, you could be in a position where from the investor, say you expect that your budget is this, because you're calculating your maximum allowable offer, looking at your rehab budget, you have your profit, your rehab budget, your purchase price, and you're looking at all these numbers and it may be very tight. So then when somebody comes in or the inspector comes in and says, okay, now you have to do X, Y, and Z, and they put a real squeeze on that profit margin, and it could go to a point to where it's like it's no longer financially feasible. So you as a GC could have been doing work, and then you're at a point to where the investor can't move forward because it just doesn't make financial sense for them anymore. So then they just leave the project or sell the project, and you may have trouble recouping your funds or the amount what you put into the project because of what happened with the building inspector being involved in the project. Now, this is not me railing against building inspectors. Matter of fact, when I applied for my GC license, the building inspector for the city I stay in, he actually wrote me a letter of recommendation to include. I asked them for a letter of recommendation because they had saw my work previously and made comments on the quality of the work that I did, and I knew that he was a proponent of me getting he knew my quality of work. And from the perspective of applying for my GC license, I knew that it would be something where the licensing board would say, oh, if the actual building inspector is giving him a letter of recommendation, that this is somebody who's really qualified to sit for the test. So that's a little tip for the many people who've reached out to me about getting their GC license. If you work with the building inspector, it doesn't ask for a letter of recommendations, at least on the residential basic side of things, but I added it anyway because I knew he had seen the quality of my work and I figured it couldn't hurt my application. So I had asked my building inspector to write me a letter of recommendation. And many times it is needed because there are some people who just get involved in renovations, and that building inspector can save whoever the property owner is. They could save them sometimes by getting that permit and keeping that minimum standard in place. because really that's what the building inspector is set up there for. Some people think that the building inspector is going to maintain this high level of quality. The building code is set for a minimum standard. Don't go beneath this line. It's not for here's the best practices ever. This is the cutting edge building science. That's not what you're typically seeing. Now, a lot of people, such as myself, I nerd out on that type of stuff. Okay, what sort of solutions do we have for potentially extending the life of the product, making it more energy efficient, potentially being able to build at a more affordable cost, and how to really make cool spaces that really, first of all, at a very basic level, provide a place for people to work, a place for people to sleep at night, a place for people to go eat, because real estate and construction touches everything that we know of the world. And we want to make sure that a certain level is kept, but the building inspector themselves, they are just there to make sure that it doesn't go beneath this level of building quality. But that doesn't mean a lot of stuff doesn't get past building inspectors too. So even if you do pull a permit, there are situations where the quality of the product being built is still crappy. So it's not a catch-all. It doesn't save you by having a building permit, although there's just pros and cons to pulling a building permit, particularly on smaller projects, because you could really just wind up in a situation where, like I said, I went from a $20,000 project to now a $100,000 project. And this is a industrial warehouse, a smaller industrial warehouse, but that's a big jump in costs and what the client expected to pay. And that could have been the difference between you actually having the project and you having a no-go on a project. Let me know your thoughts. Should you pull a building permit? When should you pull a building permit? For me, it's always looking at the situation and seeing things, because even though technically you may have to do it, sometimes the building department may tell you, you don't need to pull a building permit in this case. Typically, if it's more cosmetic in nature, they're not really concerned with it, although you may be replacing something like a toilet. Now, typically they're not going to require a building permit for a toilet, but depending on the language, it may be a situation where technically you're supposed to pull a building permit on that toilet, but realistically, you're not pulling a building permit on a toilet. So it just all varies. But I want to hear what you have to say. Let me know. Pull a permit, don't pull the permit. When should you pull it? When should you not pull it? What are those gray area situations that you can think of? And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this with anybody who you think will find value from it. Once again, my name is Derek Cafe. I am the qualifying broker for Cafe Realty. We're a commercial real estate brokerage specializing in investments, land, property management, and tenant representation. I'm also a licensed general contractor with Code Black Construction. Both of my companies are based here in Austell, Georgia, and we serve a good chunk of the Atlanta metro. So give me a call. I'd be glad to work with you. And until the next video.